my name is Thompson, co-founder and CEO of Mzansi Meat Co. I've been working in food for the past 10 years and with particular attention to alternative proteins and trying to look at why people eat the food that they do and particularly why do they eat meat. So for 10 years I've been trying to ask the question of how do we promote plant-based foods or trying to get people to eat less meat, for example. But what I've found that it's not necessarily about going to people and saying I'm going to take something away, braai food, etc., but rather what can we add? And that's what we've been doing at Mzansi Meat Co. It's looking to add protein to the equation instead of taking it away. So first, as you said, a little bit of background on what cultivated meat is and how it came to be. So it was actually first popularized by Winston Churchill back in the 30s. He said, why do we need to grow a whole chicken when we only want to eat the chicken breast? Some 50, 60 years later, a Dutch scientist by the name of Mark Post actually made it possible. He grew the first cultivated beef burger in the world. It was launched in London at a fancy event and it cost something like £250,000, no dollars. Quite expensive. That's obviously not the price point that we're aiming at, and in the past 10 years that price point has come down considerably to almost about $11 or so a burger. So that's what it's been, that's the trajectory of cultivated meat, but it's now arrived in South Africa through Mzansi Meat. And so what is it? Well, we start off by going to an animal and we take a tissue sample, which is almost the size of a peppercorn or maybe a small thread. It's from behind the shoulder. It's just, there's a few reasons why we do it there, but it's just the best place to find it and it's the least intrusive on the animal. We then go and take that small tissue sample. The animal goes on with its day. There's no harm to it besides being a bit groggy after the anesthetic. And then we take that small tissue sample and we place it in a media that allows those cells to then go and replicate. What we do is add a few amino acids, nutrients, fats, salts, and these cells start doing what they naturally want to do, and that is expand. In order to enable that to happen, we need to keep the conditions of about 36, 37 degrees, which is the body temperature of people, animals, everybody who's a mammal. That is the conditions, and it's very controlled. And because of that controlled condition, we are able to avoid any of the antibiotics and some of the hormones that you might find in sort of more conventional type meats, particularly when it comes to intensive animal agriculture, because these animals are in such tightly packed conditions. So we are able to do it in a far more sterile environment, far more controlled, and what we believe is just a better way of doing it. But that isn't the whole story. After those cells start what we call proliferating, we then need to attach it to something, because if in your body it's a 3D matrix, your cells are kind of growing in a let's say in a 3D matrix. We then attach it to what we call a scaffold, and that scaffold is exactly what happens in your body, but we're doing it with something called mycelium or mushroom. And that is then where those cells go into a larger area and kept at that same condition, 37 degrees, and things are allowed to be fed at bigger scale. We are then able to then go and compact that biomass of meat into something that would then form a burger or a sausage. So it's the same process, except we just take out the cow, the middleman. So I stopped eating meat about 10, 15 years ago, and I was always focused on talking about a moral reason for doing it. And I think a lot of the industry also thinks that, whether it's in renewables or in eating food. But I think that a lot of people within the space have sort of neglected some of the key components: price, taste, and convenience. If you leave those out, people aren't going to buy what you're selling. And the fourth component that is always left out is culture. I think if you don't address culture in the South African context, the importance that cattle plays in rural areas, or the importance that the braai plays in every South African household, you're never going to get it right. And if you look at that first and then start addressing things maybe like climate change or purchasing things that are supposedly better for the environment, then you're going to have a lot more impact a lot quicker. So if you look at the trajectory that plant-based has had over the last 10, 20 years, you wouldn't have found as many plant-based options as you did now. Not even the last 5 years. Something like oat milk has become almost ubiquitous at every coffee shop, particularly when it comes to the bigger cities. There's been a massive growth. The prediction is for that to almost occupy about 25% depending on how you look at it, of the total protein market in the next, I think by 2030, or maybe a little bit longer. You can also look at maybe in America where oat milk and plant-based milks in general almost occupy about 10% of the current market. Now, the trajectory of cultivated meat and cellular agriculture, which is the broader term for cultivated meat, is less clear. It's a younger industry. It's still very much in the early R&D phase. Internationally, there were about 4 companies in 2015, 2016 doing cellular agriculture. Now we're looking at about 100. About 25 of them are focused on the consumer, such as us, that sort of making that final end product. The ability to produce and specialize has increased drastically and reduced costs because there's more companies working in the space. So I think all this sort of comes back to the final question about is maybe not necessarily when, but when do we get scale? And that's the most important thing, because right now it's been proven we can do it. Companies are doing it overseas, companies are doing it locally, that you can produce cultivated meat, but can you do it at a place that its ability to service the market? The timelines internationally and the ones that we are trying to follow is the end of 2022 to get into some type of retail. Smaller scale, maybe your more niche places, more niche restaurants, and the following year something to be a bit more expansive. But that still requires a hell of a lot of work, and the key component is how much the actual inputs, obviously it's the same as like every other industry, it's the inputs that go into it, what we're going to feed this cultivated product, as well as the R&D equipment. It's very expensive and it's very, very specialized. But as we know, a cell phone 20 years ago cost 100x to what it costs now. And so that's the kind of model that we can follow as well. As soon as more companies get into the space, bigger industry follows, and then we're going to see that price drop off drastically. And we've seen it ourselves. We've gone on some of the inputs that we are putting together. They've dropped tenfold in the last just a year of us working on it. So it's definitely possible, but it definitely requires a lot of money, and that's a big a hurdle that we have to get over. But we are starting to make quite a significant amount of progress, and investors around the world and in South Africa are starting to see Africa as the market that they need to look at, because it's been incredibly neglected. And when you start looking in Africa, you then are going to be able to achieve that kind of scale. The barriers to entry are simple. It's getting capital, investment, and then getting the right people to implement that. In South Africa, there are some incredibly talented people, but they're all involved in different industries, medical, big pharma, etc. So what we've had to do is repurpose them and bring them into cultivated meat, because there was no one doing it a year ago. So that's been a challenge, but we are addressing it. When it comes to the competition, I don't necessarily see anyone else in cultivated meat as the competition. I only look at the meat industry, and I want to be involved in the meat industry because I believe we are a meat company. So when it comes to competition, it's going to be your existing conventional agriculture, and I think we're going to be able to help out opposed to be seen as a disruptive element, because South Africa doesn't still eat enough protein in certain areas, particularly in the rural places. A key discussion is consumer perception. I think a lot of people think you bring something out, they're going to buy it. We've done a bit of research. There's not much, but currently, as it stands, South Africans, on average, seem to want to eat cultivated meat, which is extremely encouraging to us. A big driver is environment, which is another great thing. But when it comes to exactly what our product is compared to what you might see currently, we aren't a plant-based product. We are not a veggie burger. We are not something like Impossible or Beyond Meat. Those are plant-based products made from plant proteins that then try and mimic the taste of meat. We are meat. We are trying to take cells from an animal and grow meat. It's as simple as that. So when it comes to what vegans and vegetarians and maybe flexitarians might think of the product, it might be quite interesting. And I've gotten anecdotal evidence from people saying what they would and would not do. I think a traditional, like my mom who hasn't eaten meat in 30 years, she's probably not going to be a customer. I think it's going to be people that were recently vegetarian and vegan who are saying there's some motivations for doing it that might do it and eat our product. But for the most part, who we are trying to target is your typical South African that is looking for something on the braai that just so happens to be a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more better for themselves or for animals. So I think that's the person that we're looking for, that recent person who's looking at food systems opposed to someone who's been a long-standing vegetarian or vegan who's happy with eating other plant proteins. Look, I think it's an expensive route that you have to take because it's new. It's a new technology, particularly what we're doing. And you're excited about it. So you also see there's a lot of people putting a sustainability logo on everything and it starts shooting off and doing well. But I don't think it's that genuine when you do stuff like that. So I think for us, it's been trying to stay genuine the entire time of this process. Myself and my co-founder, Jay van der Walt, have got 10, 20, 30 years in animal advocacy, and we're really passionate about it. So what our biggest learning, I think, to date, and we're a young company of just over a year, is when to say no. We've had a lot of people come from different backgrounds, a lot of investors with different sort of agendas, and the ones that we've said yes to have been incredible, and the ones that we've said maybe not have, it's been the right decision, but it's been very difficult, particularly when you know you're under a lot of strain to go and actually produce something as quickly as possible, in as cheap a way as possible. Mzansi Meat wants to make meat for Africa. I mean, it's in our tagline. It's actually what we embody as a company. We want to tackle food security. Those are the big ideas and the big challenges that we want to face on the continent. Currently, it's too expensive. Meat is too expensive. It's not affordable to everybody. If you look at some of the rural parts of South Africa, what they're eating is offcuts of meat, you know, your trout, your snout, your chicken legs, etc. So meat in itself at the moment is also not affordable to everybody. And you can see it by the per capita consumption across the continent. Will we be able to produce meat at a point that is price parity and then cheaper? Definitely. If you think about it, the cow has been doing this for 10,000 years. It's maximized its efficiency. We've only just gotten started and we've dropped the price incredibly in the last 10 years as an industry. So I completely believe that within the next 10, 15 years, you can see a price parity amongst cultivated meat and conventional meat, and then that going to service the rest of the continent. And there it's about individual countries and looking at what the needs are. It's maybe not what we're used to when it comes to maybe a more Western diet. It's got to be suited to the African palate. We're first looking at burgers and sausages because it's something that can be quickly put into the traditional, maybe fast food sector or quick service restaurants. So that's kind of the driver to get that scale. Once you've been able to achieve that scale, then you can start looking at your 3D cuts, your whole cuts of meat, steaks, potentially growing bone. A company in Israel have already gone out and printed a ribeye steak. So the ability to get steak at that sort of 3D and including other elements, particularly like that fat and maybe bone, is possible. It's something that we could potentially do, and there are others that are looking at it across the world. But I think it's very key, particularly in that South African context on the braai, putting those chops, etc. Now, when it looks at the African context, we don't see the likelihood of people going out and eating burgers and sausages. But what is more important, what is more interesting is definitely is chicken, and then also goat or lamb. And particularly when it comes to a chunk, because there's stews and curries that are far more favorable than what we see here. And that's something that we would also definitely look at. We've already started chatting to potential partners in East Africa, and it's something that is on the way. But South Africa is definitely our first focus, and that's why something like a burger or a sausage makes a lot of sense. By 2030, I think you're going to see a massive adoption by the industry, the conventional meat industry, into cultivated meat. They're already starting to look at it as potential for their expanding their yields in the future. I think you're going to see around 25% of the market completely owned by something like plant-based meats, and then around 40% is going to be cultivated. That's where we are predicting, and that's where a lot of other people as well. You're still going to see conventional agriculture existing, but it's going to be a very, very different landscape. However, it's still going to be the same product at the end of the day, and that's meat.